Okay, quick lesson on simple analysis today. The basic building blocks of all analytical work that you'll do for English, and a skill that you really need to have under your belt before you hit senior years for your analytical responses. So the first thing we're going to do is read a text in its entirety. Okay, beginning to end, however long it is. Try to avoid reading summaries, watching film versions instead of doing the reading. Obviously, that's not going to help you in the long run. When you are reading it, you're reading it in order to find an argument. Okay, so the point of this is to read a text and figure out what it is that you think the main idea is. At the basic level, we just find a theme. So you might have done in your junior years, you say things like, oh, that's about love, or that's about hate, or appearances versus reality. But we want to develop that a bit more the older we get, and we want to have a bit more of a complex discussion about what is in the text. Also, this argument is derived from whichever rubric you are studying, which means what are you studying this for? So it's always useful to ask at the beginning of a topic what ideas you're meant to be looking for. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to try and find techniques. Now, this is probably one of the more concrete elements of the English course, actually having to name a technique and knowing that you've got the right one for starters and knowing what it does. When you are doing so, you can take out your trusty literary techniques table to help you out. If not, contact me and I'll send you one through. Okay? All right. So when you're finding your techniques, it's not enough just to find them, because there are some techniques that we can all find, but we need to question them. We need to be able to say, is it useful? Have I picked a technique that is of any value to what I'm trying to analyze? Or have I literally just gone and found the easiest one that I can find, but it's going to be very difficult to explain? So the next step then is to actually analyze that technique. We should know by now that analysis equals the impact of the technique on you as the audience. Okay, and we find out what it's meant to be doing to us. And then after that, we write up our analysis. So I am going to go through each of these steps with an example to show you how to do this, and also to feed you some other questions you can ask yourself whenever you get stuck at a certain point. So the example I'm going to use today is a short extract from the first chapter of a novel called Beautiful Ghosts by Elliot Patterson. It's a beautiful extract with some really lovely writing in it. So we're just going to use this as an example. Okay, so there are sounds in Tibet heard nowhere else in the world. Hollow moans inextricably roll down the slopes of snow-capped peaks. Rumbles like thunder course through valleys under cloudless skies. On moonlit nights in the mountain wilderness, Shan Tao Yung had heard a tiny ringing tones floating down from the stars. At first, lying on his gulag prison bunk, Shan had felt fear at hearing such eerie sounds. Later, he had decided that they had to be the workings of the thin, high-altitude atmosphere and the wind of shifting ice formations and temperature changes between summits and valleys. Had concluded there were scientific explanations. But after 5 years, Shan was no longer certain. After so long in Tibet, he had abandoned most of his prior beliefs about the workings of the world. Okay, so first thing I've done is I have read the text. I asked myself, what is it about? At a simple level, there seems to be a gentleman who is in a gulag prison in Tibet, and he seems to have been there for 5 years, and it's predominantly about introducing this particular setting, and that at the moment I can gather that the setting is a beautiful one, but holds a lot of perhaps horror or ominous feelings about it. So I'm reading, I say ask what it's about. The next thing I'm looking for are any key ideas. Now, as I said before, how you read a text is determined by what you're reading it for. So your rubric would be important here. Let's pretend that I'm looking at this text for human experiences. So my key ideas, what can I say about his emotions, his experiences, his behaviour, his motivations? And I might say, okay, I feel like there's probably some fear here. I feel like there is a sense of hopelessness. I feel like there is a lack of control. So, from here on in, what I am looking for comes with proving that these particular ideas actually exist in the text. Okay, my next job is to find some techniques. So, I can go for a full-out annotation, and I can find every technique possible in here if I choose to. But given that I wouldn't be able to talk about all of that in the set time or in a set word limit, that seems a little bit redundant. So I'm going to find the ones or the lines that I feel best prove fear, hopelessness, and a lack of control. So for fear, hollow moans inexplicably roll down the slopes of snow-capped peaks. That beautiful line. Rumbles like thunder course through valleys under cloudless skies. Also another beautiful line. On moonlit nights. I might skip that one over. At first, lying on his gulag prison bunk, felt fear at hearing the eerie sounds. Later, he decided that they were the workings of thin, high-altitude atmosphere and the wind of shifting ice formations and temperature changes between summits and valleys. There's some scientific explanations. And then we have the most powerful word in the English language, but was no longer certain. I might be able to use that. Okay, so now I've highlighted a whole bunch of stuff. Highlighting is useless unless you make yourself some links to what you have just highlighted. So let's have a look at some techniques here. Hollow moans inexplicably roll down the slopes of snow-capped peaks. We have a few things here as far as techniques go. And we're going to go for the most basic ones. In the event of analysis in an essay, we can go for more complicated ones and look at the text as a whole, which we'll get to in another lesson. But for basic analysis, look what is in front of you. Don't try to overdo it. Okay. Now we have auditory imagery. It's a pretty basic technique, but very effective. Rumbles like thunder course through valleys under cloudless skies. So our easy technique there is the little brother to the metaphor. It's the simile. But we also have this strange thing. Rumbles like thunder course through valleys under cloudless skies. Generally speaking, you hear thunder, you see clouds. So we do have this clash here, which to me seems paradoxical perhaps, or if we don't want to go that far and have to explain the actual paradox underlying it, we can perhaps say that we have this contradictory imagery. So we can talk about the juxtaposition. Of the thunder and the cloudless sky. Further down, workings of the thin, high-altitude atmosphere and the wind, of the shifting ice formations and temperature changes between valleys and summits, had concluded. Can you notice how that sentence there, later, is much longer than the rest of them? So I look for the punctuation here and I consider, well, what's actually occurred there? And it seems to be a bit of accumulation, a bit of a list of things that it possibly could be. What have I done? Sorry. Brain freeze there. Accumulation. And then we are followed up by this truncated sentence, which creates a lot of contrast. Okay, none of those techniques on that page are particularly sophisticated or particularly difficult to find. But now I'm faced with a decision. So I've found some ideas. I read through my text, talked about fear, hopelessness, and lack of control. Now I've found some techniques. But now I need to question whether or not these ones that I found are even useful in the first place. Do they do anything? Okay, so let's have a look. I want to see if I think it proved fear, hopelessness, or lack of control. Hollow moons. I think this one talks to me about fear. That makes me, it sounds creepy to me. Rumbles like thunder course through valleys under cloudless skies. I think here I also have some fear and maybe some lack of control. I could prove that. Now I get down here in this whole cumulation. I think there he is grasping for control. You know when we want to have a control over something, or we want to prove that we're right and we start to ramble and we reel off all this information or that we think that we know? It seems to be what's happening there. And then when it's contrasted with this truncated sentence, there I can see that he has a lack of control. Doesn't matter how much he knows, he's not certain anymore, which I think also creates a sense of fear. So from what I've taken out from my techniques, I can see that I have questioned it and I can prove something to do with fear and something to do with a lack of control based off the techniques that I've chosen. The reason you need to take the step to question what you've chosen is so that you don't end up in a situation where you choose a technique such as alliteration, which tends to be the go-to one because it's quite easy to find, and then suddenly have nothing to say about it because it doesn't actually do anything within the context of what you are trying to argue. You need to be careful that your choices are judicious and that they enable you and open up the opportunity to actually analyze, not just state that there is a technique, because that in itself is not analysis. Okay, so I found out what is useful. My next part is to analyze. Okay, so this analysis is the crux of the skill. This is saying that because Patterson used a particular technique, you have decided that the impact of that is a particular way on you, or has a particular impact on you. So this is at a basic level. You can conceptualize it this way. Let's say that a technique can have one of three or some combination of these three impacts on you. It can make you feel something, it can make you think something, or it can make you learn something. Okay, feel, think, or learn. Okay. With our feel, think, or learn, just so we're clear, there are obviously other options. You don't have to stick with those, but if you are struggling with analysis, this is a good way to conceptualize it. The next way of kind of struggling our way through this, if you are in trouble, is to think, okay, there are going to be certain types of techniques which are more likely to fit underneath each of these impacts. So, for example, for feel, it seems to me that techniques such as imagery, maybe some metaphors and similes, punctuation type techniques, these tend to be there to provoke an emotion in you. So if this were a speech or we're talking about rhetoric, they're used to provoke pathos. Okay? Thinking is perhaps more things like truncated sentences. They have an auditory impact that makes you stop and think about what was just said, that it breaks the flow of something. Rhetorical questions, They're there to make you think. Even, say, juxtaposition at times, because you have to consider the opposition between things. And then learning might be things more like illusion and intertextuality. Now, obviously, that is not an exhaustive list, but you can start conceptualizing your techniques into groups in order to understand what they are doing to you if you are struggling with that step. So let's say now I'm here. I'm going to look at, I particularly like this part, so I'm going to look at the techniques specifically used in the second paragraph, and I'm going to look at how the accumulation here contrasts with the truncated sentence there. So just so we're clear, the accumulation was the creating of a list by his using thin, high altitude atmosphere, winds, shifting ice formation, temperature change at summits, valleys, all of this accumulation of this scientific type language, which is directly contrasted with this short, which means truncated, sentence about him not being certain anymore. This was him being certain, this is him not being certain. So we can see a shift. Now I say to myself, okay, I have truncated sentence and I have accumulation. And I read that passage and I say, well, do I feel anything? Not really. Generally, scientific jargon isn't making me feel something. Am I learning something? Well, yes, but is that the point with regards to lack of control? Probably not. But it has made me think about it. It's made me think about what has changed in his person. It's made me think about how naive his desire for control in the first place was. So now that I have all of those ideas flowing around in my head, I'm going to write a piece of analysis. Now my piece of analysis is effectively a cause and effect process. The composer did something, used his techniques, which in this case I'm saying made me think something about my key idea, which in this case I said was lack of control and fear. So I want to be able to get that writing process into a sentence, an analytical sentence. So I'm going to make sure I speak about the composer, not about the character, because I am talking about this cause and effect situation. So I'm going to say, make sure I spell the composer's name right, Pattison. What did he use? Use of scientific accumulation directly contrasted by a contradictory truncated sentence as the protagonist, this is the main character as far as I know, questions his previous confidence. And at this point I can add in my quote. You would have to write the quote in there. Okay. Now, what did I say that it did? I said that it poses questions, because it's made me think, about the validity of desiring control whilst existing Okay, so let's read that through. Sorry, stop talking there. So Patterson's use of scientific accumulation, directly contrasted by a contradictory truncated sentence, as the protagonist questions his previous confidence. And then I would give my quote. Poses questions about the validity of desiring control whilst existing in a world where the individual seems overpowered by the environment. Okay. In this case, it would also probably be the situation, given that he's in a gulag prison, but we didn't deal with that today. Okay, so my sentence, how do I know that it's analytical and not just recount? I have made sure that I have used techniques. I have made sure that I spoke about the composer. I would have put my quote in. And I have said its impact on the audience, specifically from those techniques, the audience being myself and you. That process equals analysis, which we know is, for whichever acronym your school uses, but in effect, you name a technique, you give an example, and you explain. So technique, example, explanation. And that process over and over again equals analysis, which is what you have to write the vast majority of the time. So it's your turn now. I want you to find any piece of writing, be it one from school or be it one just off the internet. I just Googled novel extracts to find that piece of that text to study. So you read it, come up with an argument. You find the techniques. You question whether or not those techniques are useful to prove your argument. When you have found it, you analyze, deciding whether you feel, think, or learn something, and then you write it into a cause and effect sentence. We will go over some more cause and effect sentences in our next lesson if you need some performers to be able to help you get into that mind frame. Okay, analyze away. If you need extra help, head over to the Ponder Realm for more prompts. Thank you.